Hi, my name is Sheryl Cohen. I'm an educational psychologist and a mother of 4. I've been practicing in South Africa for 30 years, and I hope to bring you some practical tips and insight into the topic of grief and children. These are two words one never wants to put together in one conversation. The hope is that children will have happy, blissful lives and that they will grow and develop with love, support and laughter all around them. Nobody wants to burst the bubble. However, when death of a loved one happens, there's a multitude of losses on so many different levels. And it's made more complicated by the child's age and stage of development. I would like to look at loss and grief through the lens of age and stage of development of your particular child and of all children in order to help to gain insight and to navigate these difficult waters with practical tips that will be suitable for that particular stage of development. But before we begin, let's look at 2 or 3 models of grief. The one is presented by Daniel Siegel, who has written many books on parenting, and he looks at the relationship between brain, mind, and relationships, and how strong relationships, how important relationships are in shaping the mind and even the brain and neurons. He cites a particular experiment called the still face experiment, which is a difficult study to implement for both babies and parents. In the experiment, a parent is asked to sit opposite their baby, a baby of 4 months old, and to engage with them, and at a particular designated time to stop engaging, and then to have a very still face. And the study looks at the reaction of the children or the babies to see what they do and how they respond. And it's quite interesting to notice that within 3 minutes, the babies start to become more animated, they look for more connection, and it suggests, among many other studies, that children and babies are born with a need to connect, where they are wired for connection, for attachment, and for responses from others in their world. This is how they develop a sense of self. Then, after 3 minutes, they become agitated and distressed and angry because they are wanting the connection and they're not getting it. So already we're experiencing the loss. This is important because it definitely feeds in to our understanding of loss and grief on a much greater level. This is obviously a smaller level, but it's a microcosm of what happens when there's the death of a loved one on a much greater level. So Daniel says, and then just to go back to that particular study, is that the children then become quite outraged, they become much more angry. Many babies put their hand in their mouths, or they start to eat their clothes or suck their clothes. So they look for physical ways to self-soothe. And then if the study goes long enough, which many parents stop before it gets to this stage, which is only around 6 minutes, the baby actually withdraws. They look despairing and quite depressed. So we see over here that there's a process that happens in behavior, in loss, and possibly in withdrawal. And that mirrors the grieving process as well. But what's important about this study and this model is that Daniel Siegel teaches us that we develop a map through our relationships and our engagements with significant others. And we develop what he calls a me map, which is an internal picture of me through the way in which another parent or one's own parent sees oneself. There's a you map, a map of how the child sees others, and a we map of how the child sees the world. He says that grief breaks the map, and it's about rebuilding a new map, and that's one of the goals of the grief process and the support that we as parents or professionals provide to our children in order to help them to heal. Another model is the one of Kubler-Ross. Kubler-Ross wrote about a 5-stage model in the 1970s. She's a Swiss psychologist, and she talks about these 5 particular stages. The first one being shock and denial, which is often the first response, she says, to devastating experiences of loss. After that is anger. Tremendous amount of rage can come in that stage. Why did you leave me? How am I meant to manage this family on my own? So whether it's children or adults, she says it covers all different, all the stages and ages of development. Bargaining, if I'm really good, well, and I've heard children say this in my own work with children, in therapy with them, if I'm really, really good, and I do all of Hashem's mitzvot, then will Mashiach come, and then my mom or my dad will come back. So there's bargaining. There could be bargaining in the process of dying, of please Hashem, don't let this person leave me. So there's that, which is a normal response. There's depression, which is the 4th stage, and that's a tremendous intense sense of sadness, and it's normal considering the circumstances. And then she says that the 5th stage is acceptance. Now, the point about Kubler-Ross is what she did add to this model is that it's not linear, and that it's more circular, more what Wordsworth called or refers to as a cone in some of his poems. And I like to think of it like that the personality or the mind can go back from denial to depression, to anger, to bargaining, etc. And I'm not sure what she meant by acceptance is what we might attach to it. I think what she means by that is a new normal, a new idea of how to live our lives, or what Daniel Siegel calls about building a different or a new mind-sight map of self, other, and the world around us. Of course, this sounds like a very, very tidy model, and grief is a messy business. So maybe there have been lots of criticisms about her model, is that while we try to understand it, perhaps we also have to come to terms with the loss of not knowing how we might react, because grief is as personal as a fingerprint, and we might not be able to fit it into a neat little box or progression of emotions and stages. There's the 3rd theory that I'd like to share with you, and that's the one of an oscillating theory. And that is that we don't go through 5 stages. We oscillate between grief and recovery. We are at times sad and at times happy, at times laughing, at times crying. And vacillating between these two is a model which allows for less pressure in the grieving process, less control, understanding that it can become with what we call grief ambushes, where you just unknowingly are hit over the head and without preparation by enormous amounts of feelings, and knowing that that's part of the process of recovery and grief. So that's the 3rd model. Let's look at some assumptions now. So we've discussed 3 different models. We've discussed the one being mind-sight maps and attachment. We've discussed the second one, 5 stages of grief. And we've looked at the last one, which is the oscillating model. Now let's look at some assumptions, and then we'll look at the age and stages of development and how children experience grief through them. I think age and stage appropriate loss happens to all children. When your toddler begins to walk, of course he loses the opportunity to be uppied, because now your hands are full of parcels, you're taking them out the car and into the house, and he says uppy, and you say, no my boy, you can walk, come, let's go together, and you don't uppy him. If he were not a toddler and he was a 9-month-old baby, you would put the parcels down or hold your baby with one hand and carry the parcels with the other. You wouldn't have the expectation. And so with growth comes tremendous gains, but it also comes with some losses. And the losses are experienced by children all the time. But this is what we call age and phase appropriate losses. But when it's not that, when it's not age and phase appropriate, like the death of a sibling, the death of a parent, it's overwhelming. And it's not the same as the age and phase approach or development in ordinary everyday life. The first 18 months has been described as the age of attachment. This is when children need to develop a secure and safe connection to primary caregivers. We can think of growth and development as two circles, one being the parent and one being the child. When a baby is in utero, a parent or the mother will totally envelop the baby and think and feel for him or her. Is he hungry, tired, cold, wet, sick? What does he need in order to survive? And as he is born and growth and development happens, so the circles begin to separate. And Erickson calls this the stage of individuation, but they never completely separate, because you will always be your parent and your child will always be your child, whether they're 5 months, 5 years, 15, 55, or 105. So we call that space in between the transitional space, where there's always an area of overlap and relationship between parent and child. And that transitional space is often filled with transitional objects, like a blanket, a dummy, a bottle, things that help the child move from the inside world of self to the outside world of other. And they act very much like children's Prozac. For example, if a child falls off the jungle gym and hurts themselves, they look for their dummy or bottle or blanket in order to self-soothe, because it helps them to gain a sense of control and mastery over their emotional experience as they manage the experience of the inside and the outside world. And that's also why they use them when they go to sleep and when they wake up, etc. So this is part of a healthy development of attachment. When a parent dies during the attachment phase of development, children are at risk of developing what we call an anxious attachment. And that's because the part of parent suddenly is no longer available and no longer there for the child to develop that sense of self. Remember, children, as we said in Daniel Siegel's theory, they develop the map of who they are when they feel that they are felt, when they see that they are seen. And that reciprocal process, which is what Wilfred Bion calls reverie, is part of the process that children need. If this is your scenario or your case, then we want to be able to keep attachment at the forefront of your mind, that caregivers who are available to the child, whether it be aunts, uncles, parent who's left behind, or whoever has a relationship with the child, that they maintain attachments and they develop consistency, familiarity, predictability, and security in that attachment. What is an anxious attachment? An anxious attachment means that a child will be anxious about the reciprocal relationship in the moment, and that can become, if it lasts for too long, it can develop into some trust issues later on in life. So the child might not trust that other people will survive, they might not trust that other people will meet their needs, so it can create an arrest in development. And the theory is that when there's an arrest in development or a break in development, then that gets played out later on. So our aim is to create stability of connection. And really the physical is very much the psychological in the very early stages of life, in the first 5 years, and familiarity, predictability, structure. So if a parent who is available, who is a mom or a dad who's alive, if another the other spouse passed away, other parent passed away, but the one who's alive, what they do is they always home after work and read a story, and that becomes their routine, that they come home, they put their bag down, they go make supper or whatever together with the child, whatever it is, but some kind of routine that's predictable and consistent will help the child to be able to feel held in this difficult time. From 18 to 36 months, Erickson describes this phase as the age of exploration. This is when children begin to walk, and of course one just needs to look at parents of a 2-year-old to notice that it's tough. No longer can you sit and have coffee with your baby in the pushchair beside you. Parents of 2-year-olds or 2.5-year-olds are running after their children, making sure that they don't put their fingers in the plug, making sure that they don't run out the gate, making sure that they don't cross the road, that they don't do dangerous things, etc. So this is because they're exploring, and the whole world is very exciting for them. So our aim at this particular age of development, when loss and grief happens, is that children can withdraw and not want to explore, or they can become quite manic in their need to find and to explore and to gain control and mastery over the experience. A very good way to manage this experience is to allow children to explore within well-defined parameters and to allow them to use their transitional objects to self-soothe. So at this age, as we said, many children have something that they hold on to, which they hold as their own. It's their first internalized owned object of a dummy, a blanket, a teddy, etc. And we actually want to encourage that. There was an interesting study that was done of a group of children who lost a parent suddenly, and the researchers looked at what happened to the child's relationship to this particular object. The assumption was that if the object was a crutch, then the child would become more attached to the object. And actually, the opposite happened. It was not a crutch. Why? In fact, the child, when a parent died, many children lost interest in their transitional object, their dummy, their blanket, their bottle. Not the bottle, the dummy, the blanket, or the teddy. And why is that? Because it's almost like when the life of the parent died, the life of the object died. So we see, or the discussion from that is that these objects are the children's first internalized objects. In other words, they are building introjects, or a mommy or a daddy or a sibling, mostly mommy and daddy, inside themselves. It's a bit like when you go to the shops, you might find something, see something and say, oh, my mom would love that. Why? Because you've got a picture of your mom inside your head. Children are developing that. So we encourage them to have an internalized owned object. It could be something that belongs to mommy. It could be something that belongs to daddy, the parent that passed away. It could be a picture. It could be something that they can hold on to because they are very practical, very physical, very things need to be observable. Again, what we notice in children and grief during this age and phase of development is regression. Regression often comes in the form of toilet training, wetting the bed, if they were toilet trained, or regressing and going back to diapers or nappies. And that's part of the process of grief and loss. Just like Kubler-Ross says that the ages and phases of grief are not linear, neither are the phases of development. For example, when you met your spouse and got married for the first time, you build an attachment. You shut out, shut out the world of the other sex, opposite sex, or the world of other, men or other women, even if it's a same-sex marriage. You shut that out and you focus on this person. And that becomes your person. So that's the attachment phase. Then comes exploration. You explore. What do you like doing together? What don't you? So we see that this is really the model for all relationships. But if there's a breakup in relationship, just like there's a grief, there's a loss, and it's the same for children. In this exploration phase of development, children explore in order to gain mastery and control over their experiences. So we want to give them quite a lot of practical control, but within well-defined parameters. And that's why toddlers often say no before they say yes, because they need that sense of autonomy and power. Often parents have said to me at this toddler phase of development, gosh, I feel like I'm living with a teenager. And partly one is, because they're at the same phase of needing autonomy and control. So we give it to them, but within well-defined parameters. They can't decide if they're having a bath or a bath tonight, but they can decide whether they're going to have the blue towel or the red towel after the bath. So we set up the expectation, we give them choices within that. Again, predictability, familiarity, consistency, having charts or structure is very important because it gives that sense of control and mastery for the child. Let's move to the third stage of development. This is what is called the age of identity formation, 3 to 4.5. This is when children are hardly themselves because they dress up, they want to be superheroes, they want to be princesses, they're exploring identities and roles in relationships. What about me is like my mom? What about me is like my dad? What about me is like Superman? And what about me is like princess or a teacher or whoever? So they need to be able to explore that and to try on the different identities to see what works for self and what doesn't. And so this is an age where they need to be able to do that. Of course, it also means that they'll push the limits of that because they're working out what's the me and what's the not me. You want me to put on a jersey. I'm different to you. I don't want to put on a jersey. So oppositional behavior is a very, very common part of the process of growth and development. But in grief, it is more complicated because it means that if I'm different to you, will I be lost? Will I be abandoned? Will you leave me? It's very hard for young children to see the permanence of death. It's hard also and made more complicated by sometimes just our language and our experience of my mobile's about to die and then we recharge it. So how are children meant to kind of get with the program or the understanding that it's permanent? It's very difficult for them. And that means that sometimes we have to use the right language and we might need to say, mommy or daddy died and they're not coming back again. So we need to create a sense of permanence in our language, in those experiences. Okay, some children, that some parents have also used a different language. Mommy and daddy have passed on or passed away. I had one child in therapy that got a bit mixed up with the words and said that that worried terribly. This was a young child, that Pesach was coming and Paro was going to pass over the Jewish people, and that was a big trigger for this particular child because then it meant that maybe we're all going to die just like his parent had died. So we want to be very careful with what language we use and that we express it, and we also access children's fantasies of what does that mean. I often think when one talks to children, young children, about grief, from when they're verbal, so probably from the age of around 4, is to be able to say things like, what do you think happened? So they might say, where is mommy? Is mommy with Hashem? And what does that, you might say to them, what does that mean? What do you think? They might say, where's Hashem? Where's mommy? And you might say, where do you think mommy is? So one can start off by answering questions with a question just to get insight into the fantasy of the child. And the child might say, they're with Hashem above in the stars in the sky watching over us. And you might say, that's true. And you might say, yes, their neshama is, but we can't see them and we can't touch them and we can't feel them. But they are somewhere with Hashem in the sky high above, in the heavens or whatever. So you'll find your words, but one must make sure that it's hard for children because they are very physical, they're very practical, they're very demonstrative, and they want to see things, they want to know them, they want to see death and dying. Of course, it doesn't mean we show it to them, but that's hard for them conceptually to come to terms with that. Okay. Moving on. The next is the stage of competence. This is from 4 to 6, where children want to be competent and capable in their world. They want to be first in line. I'm king of the castle, you do dirty rascal. You know, all these kind of very macho kind of experiences. And this is hard because grief pops that bubble in a big way and helps, and unfortunately doesn't help, but it forces children to realize, it tipples them off that pedestal of being capable, of being competent, because they feel helpless and vulnerable. And it's a big knock to self-esteem and a big knock to confidence. They don't have a sense of control and a sense of mastery. So what do we do in these situations? I think that what we do is we need to acknowledge our children's difficult feelings. And I would say that a lovely model to think of it or to remember it by is to use the art of parenting. So we acknowledge the feeling. This gives children a sense of understanding. It mirrors their experience using, obviously we must use the right word. So we say, I can see you're upset, you're angry, you're frustrated. And children respond a lot more with agitated mood to grief than they do with a quivering lip or sadness. An irritable mood is, in fact, one of the diagnostic criteria of depression in children, much more than sadness. So we must be on the lookout for that. And the crossness is because it feels unfair. It's a cover for a lot of loss and sadness underneath. I often think of it as kind of a double barrel, that underneath anger is always sadness, and we have to be able to acknowledge both. I think the way to start that using the art of parenting is A, to acknowledge the feeling, R, to reflect the wish, and then T, to take action. So one might say you're very cross, very upset and sad. It feels so unfair and overwhelming and hard. You really wish that this wasn't your life, that you would feel normal again, or that things would be just the same as they used to be. Normal again is very much a teenage kind of example, so you wouldn't use that for a 6-year-old, but you would say that things were like they used to be, or things were different, and our family looked different. So you give in fantasy what you can't give in reality, and it's very, very comforting for children. It helps them to feel seen, to feel felt, and that creates the mindset map that we want them to have of self, other, and the world. And then taking action, I think we want to give them this feeling of a choice, a control, sense of empowerment, of being able to say, you are not your grief. You are not sad. You feel sad. It's a part of you, but it's not the whole of you. Or the oscillating model of it's hard and this is how you feel now, but there is recovery and there's grief, and you get ambushed and then there's recovery and then there's grief. So we might put it into a bigger context. We don't want to deny the feeling, but we want to be able to hold out the hope that this does pass, and that it might come again, and then it passes, and then it comes again. And we hold out the hope that we have each other, that we support each other while we can, and we need to be able to sit with some of those difficult feelings. I think what we want to also do is we want to help our children not split. In other words, those are the things we want to avoid, is splitting into happy and sad. In other words, I have to always be happy at home or happy with my granny, because if I'm not, then she worries about me and she becomes distressed, and I can't handle that. So that will be more for tweens. So we must help children to be able to manage their feelings and help ourselves to deal with some of those difficult feelings as well. And there's nothing for a parent more hard than noticing one's child's pain. You just want to take it all away. And of course, their pain touches your pain and it becomes much more complicated. But I think we need to be able to give children the space to talk about their feelings and not split into, I have to be happy with these people and I have to be sad with these people. And again, that's the ebb and flow of grief, and the oscillating approach is that one doesn't have to have a prescription. Some children have asked me or have expressed in therapy how people expect them to always be sad, and actually they feel guilty for laughing sometimes. And this happens more in tweens, so that's the older child, more from just before teenagers, like 10 to 12, 10 to 13 actually. And that's a difficult stage because, again, they're not sure where to put themselves, they're developing an identity, and they want that sense of belonging. And now they belong to a different group, a different club. They have to build the map again of who I am, who's my family, what does it look like, who are others, it's all new. So that identity formation needs to be absorbed, and that's why I don't think grief passes with time. It's not about that. In fact, I think grief stays the same, but what does happen is the circles around grief begin to grow, or the mind-sight map of self and others develops, and around that grief it becomes smaller rather than bigger. But it's not because it shrinks, it's just because it becomes part of a different circle or different circles and a different map. Okay, I think I'm going to stop and leave teens. There's another talk that I'm going to give on some questions about teens where we can look at strategies. I would just like to give you some random practical tips so that you can possibly share them or use them for yourself and enjoy them with your children, or not enjoy them, but try to use them with your children. I think hunting the good stuff is important, and I use that word hunting because grief is catastrophic for families and for children, and I don't think it happens by itself. So hunt the good stuff, because I feel like that also helps with create some equilibrium in the family. And it does. Why? Because there's such a sense of helplessness, such a sense of vulnerability, that good stuff is glue that builds new connections and new relationships. And we need to be able to balance the loss with some feelings of good stuff. So whether that's an ice cream, whether it's doing a puzzle together, whether it's having a bubble bath, whatever it might be, hunt some of the good stuff. That's important. I also think that it's important to still find the language also that fits with you. That's important as well, and I think we've touched on that a little bit. I spoke about Passover, and use language that you feel comfortable with with your children. Give words to feelings so that children gain a sense of control over it, and hopefully that in and of itself will also empower them. Okay, I think I've shared with you what I can in the time that's allocated, and I'm looking forward to sharing the next part with you, which is on managing grief and teens, and that will be a question and answer where I have 10 questions and I will give you 10 answers on those specific questions. Thank you for listening.